This is Razorwire, and today we're going to be talking about securing critical infrastructure. So, critical infrastructure, well, I mean, it's written in the word there, critical infrastructure. We all know that it's going to be quite key for certain services around our national infrastructure, whether we're in the UK, whether in the States, no matter what country we're in, to make sure that it's secure so that it can carry on continuing providing services to facilitate us in our daily lives. Now, I'm very, very pleased to have somebody from Dragos here. I've got Phil Tonkin. Phil, do you just want to kind of say hi to the guys out there and let them know sort of who you are, where you come from, your background, that kind of thing?
Thanks, James. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Phil Tonkin from Dragos. I work in our strategy function, but have come from a background in managing critical infrastructure in the UK, and it's obviously an important part of our mission to look at how we overall safeguard civilization and and there are many different forms of critical infrastructure. I think now it's more prevalent than ever, the individual things that we've become to rely on. We're starting to see and more the how the fragility of our critical infrastructure can be disrupted by geopolitical events, by extraordinary events like pandemic. And so it's moving to Dragos for me was a way of continuing to develop my journey in safeguarding infrastructure and starting to see how we can work together as a huge community to try and advance the development of defensive capabilities.
Fantastic. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on here. So, critical infrastructure, we have seen a lot going on in this space for the last couple of years, haven't we? But first off, for those out there who are kind of interested in the critical infrastructure space from an infosec perspective, what do we mean by critical infrastructure?
I think that the global understanding of the definition has really shifted over the last few years. Without a doubt, people have always seen, for example, electricity as being that. I think something about the immediacy of our dependency on electricity. If you do something to it, the lights go out. It's either on or off, and I think that is what it brought that focus to it. And there's never been a film from Hollywood which has included hacking that doesn't have somebody switching something off. It's whether their aim is to rob a bank or to create chaos. There's always somebody trying to hack the power grid and switch off the lights. So there's been an obvious focus on that sector as critical infrastructure for such a long time. But then, as we started to see the other forms of infrastructure, gas and water, sort of fall into those same categories. Again, those don't have the same immediate effects. If something was to happen on the gas network, it takes a long time before it physically starts to manifest for the end consumer. If suddenly we lose gas across from the continent or from the North Sea, it would take days in many cases for it to actually be seen for the consumer. So much of it stored in the pipeline, so-called line pack. But the longer term impacts of the fragility of that supply chain have started to manifest as we start to worry more about the long term supply of those things. We saw a large event with a petroleum pipeline in the US, which really shifted the understanding of the importance to civil society and the amount of unrest that it can create when some of these things are affected. But when you start to move away from the traditional utilities and you start to think about the digital economy, getting food to people, we saw that the nature of supply chain into stores was quite delicate during the COVID pandemic. Getting toilet paper onto the shelves, in order to meet demand, it only takes somebody to have a run on, to suddenly decide that there might be a shortage to create a shortage. And this, the supply chain works with tight margins. We've many years been educated as leaders and managers to think about just in time as the way to drive efficiency into businesses. Actually, it only takes a very small change to think about that becoming just too late.
I've been into the whole kind of security thing now for 25 years, and throughout my career, I've gotten kind of a key interest in things like preparation. Obviously, you have to prepare in this space. In infosec, you're always preparing for something that could potentially come down the line. I'm not saying that I go and get a load of guns and go up somewhere in Alaska and build myself my own community. I'm not quite down that route yet, but we do a lot of prepping. And I think something interesting that you mentioned just there, it's like I think a lot of people before the Colonial Pipeline incident with the ransomware attack kind of just took critical infrastructure as a given as being secure, like it was magically secure and nobody ever really felt they had to worry about it. Okay, sometimes things would overload, sometimes things would, break down or whatever, but, or you'd have high winds and you'd lose power for a bit. But the concept of having a digital based attack bring down an infrastructure or a critical, what we would call a critical infrastructure, seemed to be totally unheard of. Because, you used to hear it plenty of times here in the commercial areas as well. They're a big company, they must be secure. And it's like, I think you tend to find the bigger the company, the least secure they tend to be.
Well, the greater the attack surface, it gets harder and harder to do it. And whilst they will be mature enough to be thinking about the need to do something, it's a much harder decision to make. How do I invest, in the most efficient way to manage a risk that I've not seen manifest? It's been for many years. If you take typical regulated utilities, more into the pipelines you might see downstream of, in the gas space or the water space, you can predict the failure of a pipeline. You can predict, because you might be running tens of thousands of miles of infrastructure. So statistics and time will tell you that this many will be hit by accident, this many will fail through corrosion, this many will fail through erosion or your geological damage. None of those things have intent, though. So it is very difficult to predict, when these things are going to happen. I think when you think about ransomware, the likelihood has just gone through the roof. So it's much easier now for people to invest in putting in place defensive mechanisms. But Colonial, for me, showed that many there's this inextricable link now between IT and OT. For many years, we talked about IT versus OT or IT-OT convergence. Nobody really knew what that meant. Is it where they meet? Is it where the technology starts to cross boundaries? Is it the interdependencies? Is it the exchange of skills? They are now inextricably linked. It's still easy to define what is OT and what is IT, but when you start to look at the crown jewels of your operation and say, what do I need to move fuel through a pipeline, you start to think about what those are. They will vary from company to company. A company that manages the sale of their product, the amount that they've got and where it's going, how much they're getting for it, that's an IT system, driven by data from their OT. And so quite often, even putting in place a segmentation between those can mean that there's a disruption to supply because it's not economically viable for them to run their OT. So a lot of people talk about shutting down OT to protect it from from threats from the IT. Sometimes it's an economic decision, and every company will have a slightly different stance on it depending on how they feel they're important. I think some companies, even at a loss of revenue, wouldn't shut off their OT. Others, will because they have their shareholders to respond to, and it's a decision for each company to make, to think about how they respond and how they fit in with that societal impact. And I think utilities and those traditional forms of critical infrastructure are more in tune with that. But it's if a large supermarket was hit by a cyber attack on their warehouses and they didn't know how much they were sending out to people, or a supplier to a supermarket, would they keep supplying it because it's the right thing to do, or would they just not send it because they're going to lose revenue for every item there's different. It's a difficult decision for them to make, even if they know that their product is absolutely necessary to society.
Well, this is it. And again, going back to Colonial, I think that was a really big wake-up call for a lot of people. A lot of people outside of the infosec space to realize quite how fragile some of these systems are. And it, as you quite rightly point out, it doesn't take a lot to disrupt them. If you disrupt the gas, you're not going to notice for a little while. If you disrupt the oil, it's very quick that it suddenly goes all of a sudden completely to pot. Obviously, if the power goes off, that's a pretty instant thing as well. Brownouts, that kind of stuff. But there's a whole host of other areas of critical infrastructure that we don't consider. A lot of people, as you say, they look at the power, they look at the water, look at the light. But we do have that just-in-time piece as well for, supermarkets. I remember in the early days of the pandemic, people were buying pretty much everything they could get.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how the narrative has now really, really changed, and people are starting to ask their officials, how secure are some of these environments? You say they're secure, but we now need to prove it, because I'm seeing, every week a new hospital that's been compromised. I'm seeing, new sort of ISPs that have been compromised. Financial industries have been compromised. I mean, let's not even go into the whole SV, the Silicon Valley banking thing. Is that critical infrastructure? Is it not? Well, to a lot of VCs and to a lot of startups, that definitely is bloody critical infrastructure. I mean, what is your kind of view on that? I mean, where?
Yeah, it's suppose it's the ability for us to define what are the actual critical infrastructures and what are those supporting and ancillary services. And the European NIS directive went a long way in trying to define those, and the recent updates and implementation of that have allowed that infrastructure in certain European states to be clarified and widened. There are specifically excluded industries from some of the regulations because it's felt that they already have their own. So one of the great examples of that is the telcos. They sit, they sit outside of the NIS directive in the NIS regulations in the UK because they already have in place significant regulation and controls around them. But they absolutely underpin every part of critical infrastructure. There isn't a critical infrastructure company in the world that doesn't in some way rely on telecoms services. Now, some of them will use their own internal services. Some of them will use the telcos to manage those services, and others will just buy in that capacity. But the telcos are inextricably linked to critical infrastructure, and as we see, the cloud services start to kind of fall into that same space. If you take the pandemic, for example, if you took away Amazon, that would have been a massive impact. During that time, if people relied on those services to deliver food to their homes, they were providing a critical service, and we recognise that as society by declaring people key workers. I think more time than any time seen previously. Absolutely, we put our health services on a pillar, but there were a lot of people it became really obvious were important to society, whether it's through for waste collection, food deliveries. We accepted and appreciated the extra steps that those people made, and I think that has helped us corporately to understand. Actually, I'm a key part of this. Even outside of regulation, we speak with companies who are an absolutely key part to the distribution of goods around the country, who absolutely recognise their criticality. They know that if you don't have wooden pallets to put the goods on, they can't get in and out of the automated warehouses. They can't get to the stores, and that's food, that's medicines, that's the basic things that we need. And so companies are self-recognizing their importance. Therefore, they're understanding why they might be targeted, both because in, say, the manufacturing industries and those immediate supply chain industries, criminals recognize the cost of downtime and see that as a motivating factor in paying ransom. Ransomers are smart. They've got a reliable business model which relies a certain amount on trust. They are going out. People trust that if they pay the ransom, typically they are those people are leaving their environment and certainly giving them their data back. The business model would collapse if they didn't do that. So we see that they are deliberately targeting organizations that will be motivated to recover quickly, because it's calculable, in terms of impact. In the manufacturing industry has been the number one target for ransomware in industry over the last 12 months. We identified that through our year in review. And it's an ever growing trend. And the big motivator there is that these companies recognize their importance. They recognize the impact on them, in terms of their immediate revenues, and they're doing that. And those companies are going to start to think of themselves in that criticality, whether government decides to tell them they're critical infrastructure or not. And sometimes the knee-jerk reaction of bringing certain legislations in too fast can actually, can create negative effects, because nobody can quite agree on what regulations there should be, and then therefore they might implement the wrong controls. A risk-based approach to to managing risk within those critical organizations is always the most effective. The businesses know for themselves what their appetite for risk is, and as long as they're responsible for the consequences of their own risk management, they can are pretty good at identifying what the effective controls might be. Whilst I absolutely think that things like the NERC-CIP regulations in the US have shifted the risk needle and made it better, it's very prescriptive and it's very expensive, and every change can be challenging because not everybody agrees with it.
Are governments actually redefining what they term as critical infrastructure? Because I think the pandemic really showed where there was. I mean, remember the shipping? People couldn't unload the ships. I mean, there was even some shipping companies that went under whilst the ships were still sat there, and of course, nobody would take the crew on board. But then we have things like the pipeline with the oil. A lot of people didn't consider at the time oil to be critical infrastructure items. It was like, well, it's oil. It's. But I think a lot of the public have realised now that things aren't right. But are the governments actually starting to look objectively at what they class as critical infrastructure and redefining it?
Yeah, I think they are. From the people that I speak to, I can see that there is an appetite to continually review and analyze how these interdependencies work. For many years, the government departments in the UK have invested in and researched methods of understanding how society will operate during a time of crisis. How can you identify, if you take one thing out, what are the consequences going to be? There are some really sophisticated technologies that have been developed to try and model human behavior in these places, because that's the big variable. You don't quite know, whether there wasn't really a shortage of toilet paper. It was just an extreme demand. People didn't need it more. They just wanted it more at one moment. So it's those human factors that make it hard to predict exactly, who is critical infrastructure and how much of it is. And of course, because in many senses things are distributed, there isn't a single point of failure. Then you can take a different type of risk approach to whether there are single points of failure. We have in the UK a single interconnected national grid. We have many different DNOs and transmission operators who operate within this space, a number of different generators and an embedded generation, but it is all inextricably linked and synchronized. So there's a big interdependency there, which means it's easy for us to see it as a single system. But we might think in the supply of petrol that, there are a number of different companies. So one gets affected, then the others will still be there to pick up the slack. But actually, economics have driven a reduction in the availability of supply. There aren't anywhere near as many petrol stations as there were. They're designed to be economically viable. So they only just are able to operate. The surplus in the industry has gone, and it's where efficiency has driven the reduction in surplus. It reduces your resilience. So I think that's where it becomes important that governments look to identify what do they need to potentially subsidize in order to increase resilience. It was not possible 15 years ago for companies to keep open gas storage facilities that were inefficient. The production of LNG gas in the UK, the liquefaction of it and turning it into something that's easy to store, it uses many times more energy than it actually is holding. So it's a very expensive thing to do in this country. We shut down gas storage facilities because we didn't need it. We had plenty of gas, but all it took was for a shift in the demand centres, to mean that most of the shippers were trading gas out of the UK as it landed, to suddenly drive up prices and have a huge impact on every member of society. Every domestic customer is paying for the fact that all of the gas companies had to hedge, at incredibly expensive wholesale prices that suddenly dipped again after they'd done that. So I think it is down to the fact that because we can't invest in those kinds of infrastructure because they're not efficient, it reduces the overall operational resilience and makes us more fragile to the risks that might affect them. And in the cyber sense, it's just one way that they can be affected. And it means that as people recognize they are part of that fragile system, they need to invest in some way to try and mitigate those risks.
Fantastic. I mean, you obviously get to speak to a lot more organisations in this space than obviously I do. I mean, we've got a couple of people on our books that would be classed as critical infrastructure. But I mean, you and your company get to speak to all kinds of different organisations across all kinds of different verticals. I mean, what are you hearing from your customers as one of the key things they're most frightened of, they're most worried about? I mean, is it this kind of move to that third party, such a distributed third party model that, as we were kind of discussing just beforehand, 20 years ago, everything was predominantly in-house. Your IT department was in-house. Your computer systems were usually on-premise. Maybe a few services elsewhere that were brought in, but applications were driven by your own servers. You had obviously air gapping in certain things within critical infrastructure just to provide an added layer of protection. But all of that has now disappeared, or it's on its way out. Yeah. Is that something that you guys are concerned about, or is it something else? I mean, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I suppose there's two ways of looking at it. For businesses, they tend to be kept awake at night by two things. There's the risk of an attack and the risk of non-compliance. So, and in some ways, you should be able to be compliant as a consequence of good risk management. You should be able to manage your risks by doing the right things, and then that should tick all of the boxes that makes you compliant because you're doing a good job of managing your risks. But unfortunately, that's not quite the case, and because it is very difficult to write a compliance-based framework that doesn't drive people to do things that may not necessarily be the top of their priority list. So but organizations tend to take compliance risk very, very seriously, some more than others, but most of the organizations we work with are very driven by the reputational impacts and the cost impacts of not being compliant with legislation. And so if you think about that supply chain third-party security piece, there's a lot of work being done on both sides of the Atlantic in trying to get organizations to think about their supply chain dependencies, because we saw with the impact from things like solar winds, the attackers recognize that these are incredibly powerful vectors, to use. You're not having to just target the infrastructure of one company. You target of many. You to target the infrastructure of one, and you get access to many, or you can create impacts in many. The same adversaries, will look at the industries and look for other ways to target infrastructure. There are many common suppliers into key critical infrastructure. Critical manufacturers that supply their technologies into the oil and gas space, into the food and beverage space, and therefore they provide a single point in which those adversaries could target multiple different points of infrastructure. So I think it's absolutely right that organizations think about that third party risk because it ticks off two of those boxes. It is a real risk because it's that is a vector that criminals and state actors are using as a means to get to critical infrastructure. And it also is an important part of most compliance frameworks. So looking at those third-party risks is important. one key part that those third-party risks typically create a challenge is in remote access. More and more we see that these third-party services, whether it's a software management capability or physically managing a piece of equipment in the operational sense, relies on remote connectivity. You're connecting to a cloud service, or you're connecting to that company's infrastructure to allow them remote access, or you've given them remote access into your systems. There's a real challenge with trust there, because you're almost implicitly trusting them within your environment, which means having really robust, secure remote access capabilities is important, and having a defensible architecture that allows you to respond should there be any risks or compromises there. Because and the ownership and design of those things is very challenging in some industries, because the big OEMs want to implement their form of remote access because they want repeatability, scalability. That's how they make their business efficient. And each individual customer has their way of doing it, and there's always a clash. And so you end up with either the OEM or the third-party software provider has to deal with a different ecosystem of capabilities, or the end user does, usually the end user. And that's harder to defend, harder to do vulnerability management. The key vulnerability management is one of the critical controls. It's very difficult in the industrial space to keep everything patched and up to date, but thinking about the capabilities you have on your perimeter, that's probably one of the first places to look to make sure you don't have vulnerabilities. And if you have one particular remote access capability and you've got one type of firewall, whilst there might be some risks in that, it's much easier to keep on top of patching and maintaining those, that technology if you have one or two there. But if you've got 10, because you've got 10 different providers who all insist in their own type, it makes it hard. So it fits in so many ways that the way that third party risk is being used by criminals and state actors to as a means of getting to these critical companies.
I think there's a couple of things to unpack there for me. I mean, one of the difficult things, I think, having been in this space for as long as I have, it takes compliance to really drive people to actually secure themselves. I think that's one of the biggest lamentations that I have on that particular score. And I think the other one is, and it's more of a question really. I mean, a lot of us infosec people have been around for a while have always kind of said, look, you're not giving us any kind of budget at all to help secure you. It's like, you're giving me £5 and a pickled egg, and you're expecting me to secure robustly your entire environment, your whole infrastructure, so you can continue to make good profit. But the figures that we tend to bandy around a lot nowadays, and I think some of that's changing now, is like 5 to 10% of the IT budget tends to get given to infosec people. And it's like, well, once I've bought like 2 or 3 decently expensive tools, that's it. I'm done. I haven't got any more. And then, I next year when I renew, unless you give me more budget, I'm going to be sat here and I can't work miracles. Okay, good governance, good skills. There's a big skill shortage at the moment, obviously, anyway, but that can take you far. But you do need to have this bundle of tools, depending upon what type of organization, of course, and what you're doing and so on and so forth. But are you starting to see budgets change within critical companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think firstly, people in most organizations have typically seen IT as an overhead, and reluctantly paid for their IT. The shift to digitize business, and people have started, I think, now to recognize that yes, IT is always expensive. People always reluctantly spend their money on computers and delivering IT projects. With the idea of spending £1 billion on a financial system in a big company is, it sounds like a crazy amount of money, but that's, because it's
standard these days, isn't it?
Exactly. So, and I think people recognize now that IT infrastructure within a company is an asset and is the way in which you generate revenue. No business can do that. So that immediately shifts the idea of what it means to be, to invest in IT. security again was the poor cousin of IT for most people in the past. The shift for people to think about technology and cybersecurity holistically rather than as just a function of IT, I think is helping in terms of budgets. People, if at the board level, they don't really want to consider cybersecurity for IT, cybersecurity for OT. It's cybersecurity for my business, and many CISOs have been empowered, to report into to their boards rather than the CIO, and even in many cases, the CIO recognizes that actually the responsibility, even if there is a reporting line there, they recognize that there is a responsibility to manage risk across all of their operations. And that means working with multiple different stakeholders, but it means that people start to consider cybersecurity as part of their operational asset rather than just a sub part of their IT. It's allowed them to sort of shift their understanding of how much is there to be spent. And just again, in terms of budgets, I wouldn't underestimate how much the government has supported critical infrastructure companies by providing them the mechanisms to get money. As the NIS directive came along, regulations were put in place, and the regulated entities have been provided a huge amount of support in order and mechanisms to recover their costs. It is an opportunity for them to make money by adding to their asset base. So it's not a bottom line thing; it's a profit-making opportunity. But within the bounds of efficiency, because every penny that they spend comes from the bill payer. The regulators have been very generous in providing the mechanisms for regulated entities to regain their costs and earn some return on that investment. And even for the non-regulated entities, there are mechanisms for them to do things because their role in society is often larger than their own risk. So the consequential societal risk is greater than the corporate risk, and so it is sometimes disproportionate what you have to do in the infrastructure space, in terms of your investment. And the governments, has typically recognised that and are providing a lot of financial support.
And it's nice to hear that, because I think we're going through such a giant flux in the infosec industry at the moment. Everything's changing. Attacks are becoming far more broadcast over media. We're hearing about them time and time again. We've got, customers. And it's something interesting you mentioned actually there about, CISOs shifting in an organization's kind of hierarchy. I mean, I remember back in the day when the CIO, for instance, would report in usually to the finance director. And then that changed when, as you pointed out earlier on, when technology became so critical to the business as an asset, and it was recognized that they moved to the board. And I think you're seeing something very, very similar with infosec people, because we used to be basically lumped in, as you said, with IT, which, it didn't really work, because IT's role was there to keep the lights on, to keep the services running, and to keep things easily working so people could access them. When it came to security, they were used to it, like firewalling and some of the simple stuff. But when it came to the more complicated stuff and things like defense in depth, they used to blanch quite a bit. And of course, very few back in the day, I'm not saying that's the same case now, just in case I upset some people, the infosec person would be trying to communicate a risk to the powers that be, saying, look, no, this is a serious risk to your environment. But the CIO would be too scared to give that info and make themselves look weak on the board. So I'm seeing a big shift. I get involved now quite often as an advisor to a lot of C-suites, whereas before we'd be kind of, as consultants, we'd be talking to the CIO, maybe the compliance directors, that kind of stuff. We are now being brought on board and told, can you just have a chat with the C-suite about this? Because, the goal of any security professional is to basically secure the organization. We're not there to make money. We're not there to lose. We're there to prevent the money from being lost and from the assets to go, the way of the dodo, or for us to fail in compliance. We're seeing a lot more allies nowadays in the compliance departments and the financial departments, because they understand regulation and how important it is to maintain it, especially if you've got a legal department as well. And I think that shift and change in the way that CISOs are viewed within an organization is about time, in all honesty. I mean, you can't have everybody on the board, I get that, but if you're a decent sized organization, have your CISO at least advise you. You don't have to have them on there. They don't have to be a decision maker. Just let them advise you as to what's going on. And I think that's really good, not only for the industry, but it's also quite enriching in pushing security and building better defense in depth, both in the supply chain and outside of it.
Yeah, and it reflects internal trust within organisations as well. That you ultimately you employ a professional, in order to own and manage that risk, and the role of the CISO, it very much just carry that responsibility on their shoulders, and it's absolutely right that the expert briefs at least directly, the board. That isn't necessarily going to be the right place for them to sit. Sit with the executive. They might, even if they are reporting lines are just down to corporate organisation. But who actually presents that brief? Who owns the risks? And who is responsible? It's very key that if it's going to be articulated, it's done by somebody who really does appreciate it and isn't in any way diluting it. That's really critical.
One of the things I wanted to get from yourself, what are you seeing at the moment? What are we going to be looking at in the next 3 to 5 years? We're going through all this change. We've got hardly any infosec people trained up to do the job at the moment. We've got a million tools coming out of pretty much everywhere. And they're all being bought out and they're all being amalgamated into sort of big clients, a bit like cloud. You remember that when everybody who had IT skills created a cloud company and there was like 400 of them in one area and all of a sudden they'd all get eaten up. Where do you see kind of where things are going in the next 3 to 5 years? What are your predictions, both you and your organisation? Because, I'm sure you've got a few views on that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's funny is the sort of the shifting threat position. Whilst we always like to think about the capability of the actors and the motivation, one of the things we very much track is that capability side. We want to know who are the groups that are actively doing things within infrastructure and what are they looking at developing. With the discovery of the Pipe Dreams suite of malware, we've seen a real shift in the level of development and the capability of adversaries in this space. Utilizing the core technologies below, the boxes that people buy. So no longer just targeting a particular brand. There are some specific devices that were targeted in there, but actually the capabilities are entirely adaptable. And that's a real shift from the crash override malware that we saw in sort of late 2016, and it was in that. Many bits of that just didn't work. There was some good stuff in there. There was some really bad stuff. But we've seen some basic reuse of that, last year in Ukraine. But these new frameworks, a real shift in capability. Obviously a really great news story that it was found before it was even compiled and prevented the use of it. But the fact that somebody is likely a state investing in the capability to develop tools like that means that there's an appetite to use them, and so the sophistication of attacks, I think, is going to massively increase over the next 5 years. Just because those general capabilities are increasing all the time.
And you make a really good point there. I mean, when you think about it, these groups have been really well funded in the last 2 years with some of the monetary values they've had. And yeah, of course, why wouldn't they utilize some of that? Like any organization. I mean, the Conti tape leaks were really, interesting for me, watching them operate as an organization. And I mean, I knew that they did as a general rule. I didn't realize they were quite as well organized as they feasibly were.
Yeah, obviously the capabilities within those spaces have been focused on what generates them the revenues immediately. A number of them have added some very basic OT specific things, targeting specific file extensions, that sort of thing that they've discovered are relevant in those environments and might cause some disruption. And then you've got the true sort of state actors who are thinking about disruptive or destructive events. But there's a blurred line. It's really clean. We don't do attribution within Dragos. We track and name activity groups based on their tactics, techniques, and procedures. But many of them are aligned to the activities of a number of states. Some of it's pretty obvious, but the criminal gangs are not necessarily aligned with states. In some cases, they have allied themselves, and due to the nationalities of those people, it's clear to see that their motives and motivations change. But it's the fact that you've got this ever-growing criminal skill set, that's going to generate money for them. And you've got these plus governments funding the development of capabilities and the overlap there. We've seen that, with some of the technologies deployed in Ukraine. The disruptive techniques can be very similar to those used by criminal groups. And you see all of that overlap occurring. And I think as the criminal groups start to look to be more and more sophisticated, in particular as the IT environments get more and more defended, then they will pivot to something else, and there's a huge risk there. So I think this important thing to consider is how are the actors evolving, and looking specifically at that. It can, in terms of broader sort of commercial sense, where are the companies going? It's really quite difficult to predict what's the next new exciting technology going to be. So people are quick to go out there and develop it. Actually, by instead focusing on what are the actual risks, what's actually manifesting, and what is going to be a capability that everybody needs rather than one particular customer is asking for, is one of the key ways of ensuring that you're developing a capability that's going to actually manage the risk rather than what is the newest or sexiest thing to be doing. So it's that's something we were always looking at, is what is it that everybody needs rather than what is the new exciting thing.
Is it fair to say then you think that maybe this is the lull before a bit of a storm?
I think it's always hard to predict a storm. I think we all in the infosec community predicted a storm around Ukraine.
Well, the WF have put it in their top 8 items on their top concerns of a massive rise or a massive cyber attack, and we've all been kind of aware that could happen for a while. But I mean, it's sobering. It's sobering what you're saying.
It is a significant risk, and the capabilities are there. But as defenders, we've always managed to keep one step ahead. But it's just a challenge that we must never lose sight of. I'd hate to sort of introduce too much fear in this space, and give too much kudos to the attackers, because whilst they're getting better, as do we as defenders, and it's a great industry to be in for that, because we're motivated to do what is right. And I think that's we're lucky to work in an industry where actually all we do all day long is stop people from doing bad stuff. It's not
boring, I'll tell you that.
It's never boring, and there's a huge amount of opportunity, despite everything that might be happening in terms of the wider geopolitical sense, and what's happening with the economy. Industry still needs organizations to look after it and defend it, and that's it means it's a great place to be right now, because we are ahead of the attackers. We proved that with things like Pipedream. We got in there before they ever managed to use it, and help organizations to mitigate the threats that it might have faced, rather than responding, which is the typical thing we have to do. So you see something new, somebody's hit by it, and then you got to go and respond. We're ahead of the game, and we can stay ahead of the game, but we've got to keep developing the skills. There's a whole raft of things that need to be done in that space, and a whole other conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with you on that one, and I think one of the things I do in the masterclasses that I do, I really push. You can prep, but make absolutely certain you've got really good instant response, because you are going to have something. You can prep and you can preempt as much as possible, but you've got to be prepared to have an event, and when you do, just get it done. War game yourself.
It is our number one critical control. Is be prepared. And understand what you're going to do. Happy that as a community we kind of even in our resources that we put out through our OT CERT program, which are free for critical infrastructure organizations of any size, even the smaller ones that might struggle to finance these things. Putting some of those sort of basic exercising techniques and capabilities are there and free, because it is one of the number one things you can do to prepare is understand how you might behave in a particular exercise.
Absolutely. Phil, it has been absolutely fantastic having you on.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
You've provided some great insight, and it's always good to hear some new voices on the channel and all the rest of it with new guests. You've been fantastic, and I'll probably reach out and see if I can grab you for a couple in the future. But thank you ever so much, and good luck to you and Dragos as well. And all of you out there, you'll be seeing probably a lot of them in the future. I think they're an important aspect of what we need to do for funnily enough, our critical infrastructure. So cheers, Phil. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So thank you to all of you out there for listening to this podcast. It's been absolutely fantastic. Please feel free to subscribe if you haven't already. You can find us on our YouTube channel as well, as on Spotify and the various other different methods for the podcast material. We're always out there looking for new material to cover. If you want us to cover anything, please feel free to get in contact with us. There's various different means to do that, and let us know how what you want to know, and we'll see if we can get some of these fantastic people together to kind of discuss through with it. But thank you ever so much for watching, and we'll be seeing you again soon with another podcast. Goodbye.